Witchcraft in America has long been associated with Salem and the infamous witch trials. Historians, archaeologists, and modern-day witches have flocked to the Massachusetts village since those trials and have well documented what happened there. But much of the history of the real witches of America remains hidden, seldom discussed or examined until now. This is the Witches of the American Southwest. The American Southwest is a vast area covered with desert, mountains, and plains. Despite the view of some who think of it simply as hot, dry desert, the Southwest is abundant in water, forests, minerals, and more. It is a magical place and one of wonder. In the far past, it was home to many native tribes, including some who still live on the same land their ancestors did, and practice the same forms of witchcraft as them also. For thousands of years before Europeans discovered the New World, these natives looked to the land, to nature, for their gods. They found the healing power of plants, and they explored other worlds in their self-induced trances. When people think of witchcraft in the United States, they often think of the Salem witch trials of the 17th century. However, that is far from the end of the story as far as witchcraft in America is concerned. In 1848, at the conclusion of the Mexican War, New Mexico Territory was added to the United States. Many of the people already living in New Mexico suddenly found themselves living in a new country, and many of them believed in witchcraft. In 1882, a man named Felipe Madrid was arrested in the town of Tierra Amarilla in northern New Mexico. He was accused of torturing a woman he believed was a witch. Years before, Madrid had an affair with the woman. After they broke up, he started seeing some other women, but came down with a disease. He believed that his ex-girlfriend was a witch, and that she had cursed him. Following an old belief, he planned to abduct her and make her cure him. He sent 3 of his friends to where she lived, and they brought her to his house. Madrid tied the woman's hands and told her that he would whip her to death if she did not cure him. She protested her innocence and said that she could not cure him. He whipped her until she finally promised to give the cure. She called for ointments and medicines, and while she was waiting for them to be delivered, she escaped. Madrid was arrested and put on trial. He was convicted of committing assault and battery and paid a fine of $150. Just a few years later, in the town of Chamayo, New Mexico, a 40-year-old woman was accused of being in league with the devil. She was taken from her home by 3 men, stripped of her clothes, and stabbed to death. These 2 accounts come from New Mexico's court records and illustrate that people in New Mexico held a strong belief in witchcraft during the late 19th century. People in New Mexico generally thought there were 3 ways someone could become a witch. First, it was believed that certain children were fated to become witches. Parents grew fearful if any of their children showed any signs of strange or deviant behavior. Second, many witches were said to have voluntarily taken up the craft to get revenge on someone who had wronged them. The third group of witches consisted of those who were said to have sold their souls to the devil himself for money or power. There are stories of women who would seek out advanced practitioners of witchcraft and learn from them. In the village of Placitas, near present-day Albuquerque, a woman named Juanita was ostracized because she had a bad temper. She sought out a known bruja, or witch, named Felicia, who taught her how to prepare herbs and use them to make magic. Occasionally, advanced practitioners in witchcraft would get together and conduct formal schools in how to bewitch people, cast spells, and even transform into animals. Legend has it that one such school existed in the central New Mexico town of Piedra Blanca. Aspiring witches who attended that school were said to have learned from the devil himself how to transform into such animals as owls, doves, and dogs. For centuries, the natives lived and worshipped as they saw fit. Before the arrival of Europeans, Native American tribes had their own belief systems. It was nature-based, and indeed, they all had creation stories that, for many, included both male and female deities. Herbal medicine was practiced in almost every native tribe, and the land gave them bounties. They worshipped the land, the sun, and animals. They were untouched by the scourge that was about to come. Christianity came with the arrival of the Spanish. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they set out to not only conquer the natives, but to decimate their beliefs. Believing that their own religion, Christianity, was the way to not only save the poor deluded native tribes, but also to subjugate them. The Spanish showed no mercy to the natives and forced them to work as slaves, while at the same time bringing their Jesuit priests along to be certain that the tribes not only received the message of Christianity, but followed it. Failure to do so often resulted in death. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, most did not even consider that the peoples they had encountered had cultural and religious traditions that were different from their own. In fact, most believed indigenous communities had no culture or religion at all. As the age of discovery unfolded, Spanish and French Catholics were the first to arrive, beginning in the 16th century. Profit-minded Spanish conquistadors and French fur traders competed for land and wealth, while Spanish and French missionaries competed for the saving of souls. By the mid-century, the Spanish had established Catholic missions in present-day Florida and New Mexico, and the French were steadily occupying the Great Lakes region, upstate New York, eastern Canada, and later Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta. Many of the European missionaries who energetically sought to spread Christianity to native peoples were motivated by a sense of mission, seeking to bring the gospel to those they had never had a chance to hear it before, thereby offering an opportunity to be saved. In the context of the often brutal treatment of native people by early Spanish conquistadors, many missionaries saw themselves as siding compassionately and protectively with the indigenous people. However, that did not stop the decimation of the tribes and the decimation of their original belief systems. Despite the best efforts of the Spanish, most native tribes in the Southwest managed to keep some of their religious traditions, even though they incorporated it into the newly forced belief in Christianity. Therefore, their native religion was reduced to a mixture of ancient beliefs and new Christianity. Many tribes had difficulty with this imposed Christianity. While its words spoke of love and peace, the actions of the conquistadors showed a direct opposite. Therefore, conversion of the tribes took decades to accomplish. Indeed, the introduction of Christianity and the rift it caused between old ancient belief systems and the introduction of the new one can still be seen today in many of the indigenous people of the Southwest. While they may still have shamans and medicine men, many still shudder at the word witch. They hold on to Christianity, calling it a bad thing. That is not to say some tribes have shunned it completely, and we will examine those in more detail a little later on. During the time of the Spanish Inquisition in America, there were trials in the Southwest of those accused of witchcraft. Those trials also helped shape the belief system of many Southwestern tribes. Conquest by fear and persecution had helped the Spanish spread their religion, and they did this all in the name of love. Two women living near Santa Fe, New Mexico, were accused of murder by bewitchment and were tried by the American Spanish Inquisition. The charges were made in Santa Fe, New Mexico, by Spanish immigrants against a Mexican Indian, Beatriz de Los Angeles, and her daughter, Juana de la Cruz, a half-breed. Both women, especially de Los Angeles, were feared by many in Santa Fe for their alleged diabolical powers. It was rumored that de Los Angeles had poisoned two of her servants to death in order to test out a new recipe for a potion. Another servant told stories of her mistress casting evil spells with poppets that she buried beneath her hearth or hung from trees. De Los Angeles was rumored to have poisoned to death one of her lovers, Diego Bellido, who beat her during an argument. The poison was mixed in a bowl of cornmeal gruel. Bellido fell ill with severe abdominal pains and died within a few weeks. She also put a death hex on a royal officer, Hernando Martinez, because he had slept with her daughter. De la Cruz was said to have the evil eye, causing children and animals to fall ill and sometimes die. She flew about at night inside an egg to spy on her lovers. When she discovered that her husband was unfaithful, she gave him some poisoned, enchanted milk and killed him. The anxiety over the women reached such a pitch that an officer of the Inquisition was informed of their evil deeds. After a thorough investigation, however, Father Esteban de Pera concluded there was no evidence of witchcraft and that the women were the victims of malicious gossip. That case was then closed. Other witches were allegedly active in Santa Fe around the same time. This tale begins somewhere around 1692, following the Spaniards' reconquest of Santa Fe after the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. Juan Espinosa, a mounted soldier, was one of the young men to return to Santa Fe. Somewhere along the road, he had caught a glimpse of a young woman named Catalina Monroy. She had beautiful dark eyes and long black hair. Juan was immediately smitten, but Catalina was a flirt, and she teased many of the young men. Catalina had several suitors, including Juan's best friend, Pedro Pino. Other accounts have Pedro being Juan's commanding officer. Whatever the relationship, Juan and Pedro were opposites. While Pedro was tall, handsome, and flashy, Juan was short and pudgy, and easily overlooked. Juan had worked hard and saved his money, and was determined to marry Catalina. As was the custom of the day, he took an older person with him to ask Catalina's father, Don Vicente Monroy, for her hand in marriage. He was broken-hearted to learn that she was not interested in marrying him. Instead, she had fallen in love with Pedro. Stricken with grief and jealousy, he went to visit two witches, Donna Filomena and Donna Laguarda, who lived in the old house in the Barrio de Ancio, a neighborhood on the other side of the river. The two old crones steadied themselves on canes while tending their herb garden as he approached them. Much to his amazement, they already knew his name. Juan confessed his feelings for Catalina to them and asked if they could mix a potion that would make her love him in return. The witches said indeed they could. They began mixing herbs and chanting as they brewed tea in a pot over a fire in the corner fireplace. As the old hags handed him the finished potion, they cautioned that he must do two things to ensure the spell would work. The first was he had to kill a pig and eat its heart, raw. They told him after he had accomplished eating the pig's heart to take the tea to Catalina and have her drink it. Juan thanked the old witches and paid them in gold. He took the precious tea, but the thought of killing a pig and eating its raw heart was repulsive. He would decide, if the tea didn't work, then he may kill the pig. Tea in hand, he went to call on Catalina and her father. Don Vicente Monroy was most impressed with the present. All three of them sat and drank the delicious liquid from fine china cups. Then Catalina became ill all at once and had to leave the room. For the next several days, Juan heard nothing. He had no idea whether the potion had worked. Then one day he happened across Pedro, who was all smiles and had a light step. Juan asked him what made him so jovial, and Pedro told him that Catalina had consented to marry him. Juan was so taken aback that he stumbled to his horse, thinking of Catalina, and climbed up on the animal's back. He rode as fast as he could to the witch's house. Once there, he jumped from his horse and pounded on the door. "You lied," he screamed when Filomena opened the door. "The potion didn't work." "Did you do what we told you?" the black-clad hag asked. "Yes, I did exactly as you instructed." The lie flew easily out of his mouth. "And it didn't work. I tell you, I want my gold pieces back." Knowing that Juan had not followed their instructions, the witches refused to give the money back. At their refusal, he drew his sword. He seemed to have forgotten about their canes. As one of them swiftly hit him with hers, he fell, and his sword went skittering. One of the witches, the legend does not tell which one, seized the long sharp sword. With one swift strike, she came down on Juan's neck. His head fell away from his body and left a bloody trail as it went rolling down Debarga Street. One story claims Juan's headless body jumped up on his horse and rode down the street, trying to scoop up his head. Some Santa Feans say the sound of hoofbeats can be heard as the headless horseman can be seen on East Debarga Street on moonlit nights. While sensational, the 1692 witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts, occurred at the very end of this cycle of witch hunts. Yet Salem was not the last of such occurrences. 7 decades later and 2,000 miles away in the precarious town of Abiquiu in northern New Mexico, the last major witchcraft trial of North America unfolded. Between 1760 and 1766, some 36 men and women of indigenous background were accused of witchcraft and sorcery, of having a pact with the devil, and of engaging in a variety of activities that, to the modern eye at least, often seemed like mere forms of folk medicine. Perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of Abiquiu's history is the little-known witchcraft trials that took place between 1756 and 1766. Like the Salem witch trials, the Abiquiu ones were bred out of a complex climate of fear. This was induced by warfare with the Plains Indians. The Spanish began to settle the area in the early 1730s, but it was inhabited by local Indians long before that. There are at least 10 prehistoric Pueblo sites in the areas surrounding the town. As with most efforts of colonization, the Spanish had a lot of difficulty keeping peace in the area. They were caught between the Pueblo Indians' resistance to Christianization and raids by nomadic tribes such as the Comanches that threatened the very existence of the colony. In an attempt to bring peace to a very polarized area, the governor awarded the Indians who had been Hispanicized, those were Plains Indians and Navajos who were captured and sold to the Spaniards as slaves, the Abiquiu land grant. This seemed like a good idea because Abiquiu had previously been abandoned by the Spanish, who had settled there and then left because the raids were so constant. The Indians lived on the land grant and practiced a mixed form of Catholicism and their native religion. This mixed form was a result of pacification and Christianization that took an interesting form in this area because of the crossover of Catholic practices and the natives' religion. Practices such as confession and the idea of penance already existed in the native religion, which at first encouraged Catholics to accept and share their religion with the natives. Some of the natives in Abiquiu even became monks and religious leaders. The blending of the religions worked for a while until the Spanish discovered that their new converts were still practicing their native religion, and they had simply added Catholic ideas and practices. In an attempt to preserve parts of their original culture, the Indians were still engaging in practices like human sacrifice, which, when discovered, freaked the Spanish out a little. This discovery, coupled with the atmosphere of fear produced by Comanche raids, led Catholic priests to believe that Abiquiu was in the devil's snare. Local priests, products of the late medieval Christian worldview who believed in a stark difference between good and evil, easily saw all indigenous beliefs as devil worship. Once they began equating the native religious beliefs with the devil, it became very easy to explain the raids by the Comanches and the natives' resistance to Catholicism as a direct result of devil worship. It is important to note that native religions didn't believe in good versus evil. They had no concept of the devil. They believed in the interconnectedness of all things, and thus, when natives were accused and put on trial, their denial of evil or the devil would prove them guilty of witchcraft. What followed was accusations that included stories of love magic, sorcerers turning into cats, dogs, and owls, and one who tried to fly to the Cerro Pardal in the shape of a woodpecker. There were so many other charges of witchcraft that the investigation soon turned into a witch hunt, reminiscent of Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, as a series of charges and countercharges through the criminal justice system of New Mexico spun out of control. In 1756, an Indian named El Cojo, the cripple, was accused of having a pact with the devil. The years of investigation that followed revealed the polygot's supernatural heritage at Abiquiu. El Cojo and the other accused witches allegedly possessed the evil eye, common to European witchcraft cases, and the ability to shoot solid objects into victims' body, which was common to Navajo beliefs. Ecclesiastic investigations consulted Native American curanderos as well as Catholic witch-hunting manuals, especially the protocols of De la Pena Montenegro's Elite Real. During the witch trial that went on for 10 years, from 1756 to 1766, suspected witches were jailed and flogged, pagan idols were found and destroyed, and the destruction included several ancestral Pueblo shrines in the area. It was complicated, but clearly it was a case of cultural conflict and incomprehension. The religious authorities, although more tolerant after the 1696 reconquest, used the witchcraft issue as a means to suppress expressions of indigenous religion and cultural practices, such as traditional methods of healing. It was an attempt to bring the Indian community into the more complete conformity of the Catholic practice. Official reports incorporated descriptions of Native American hunting magic into the early modern mythology of the witches' Sabbat. Catholic clergy determined that local Native American petroglyphs were in fact satanic symbols. Priests hurriedly destroyed the rock drawings and replaced them with crosses. The legal response to the witch fears followed the tragic arc of many modern European witch trials. The accused were tortured and under torture produced lists of names. Over 200 witches were identified. Nevertheless, Inquisition authorities in Mexico City, influenced by Enlightenment writings, refused to issue execution orders, citing a lack of evidence that the devils had truly possessed the victims. Most of those accused received light sentences. It is important to note that as time went on, many tribes revisited the Catholic beliefs that had been imposed on them and reworked them to fit with their more ancient belief structure. Some tribes even adopted their own version of the oft-taught Ten Commandments. Much of the belief in witchcraft in the American Southwest had grew out of legends and lore from a long ancient past. Europeans encountering the tales of magic when they first met the natives of the Southwest most certainly associated them with witchcraft. To the natives of the region, though, they were, much like their counterparts in Europe, the cunning folk, simply following traditions of worship and healing that had been handed down from their ancestors. Before we move on to modern Southwestern witches, we'll take one more look at a person impacted by the American Spanish Inquisition. 2 years before 5 traders discovered human bones scattered across the desert, a man named Bernardo Gruber, a German immigrant and trader from Sonora, made his way northward, likely following the trail through the foreboding desert landscape, accompanied by 3 Apache servants, including a teenage boy named Atanzio and 2 women. He led a pack train that included 10 pack mules, 18 horses, and 3 oxen. Gruber would certainly have known the route, which lay east of the Rio Grande and the Frio Cristobal, and the Cabo mountain ranges, crossed one of the most punishing parts of El Camino Real, the Cerro Adentro, the old Spanish road that connected Mexico City with Santa Fe, some 30 to 40 leagues, which is roughly 90 miles in length. Across desert sand and rock, it passed not a single dependable waterhole. It offered little forage for mules, horses, and oxen. It left the thorns of its cholla and prickly pear cacti embedded in the flesh of the travelers. As he drew near the Spanish settlements and Pueblo missions in what is now central New Mexico, this German trader may not have known or fully appreciated that the Spanish Inquisition had extended its malignant tentacles not only across continents by the 17th century, but even up the El Camino Real and into the Southwest. So far away from Europe, however, the German, El Alemán they called him in Spanish, might not have realized or fully appreciated the influence and control of the frontier friars empowered by the Inquisition. Apparently, Gruber carried on his business of trading routinely until Christmas morning of 1668. For some strange reason, during Mass that morning at the Mission Church, Gruber and a friend, Juan Martin Serrano, climbed the ladder to the choir loft. As the Mass proceeded, Gruber took several papelitos, small pieces of paper, from his pocket. He and Martin wrote on 11 of them, mysterious letter combinations separated and bracketed by crosses. Abna plus Adana. Gruber whispered to the choir members, "He who eats one of these slips of paper will, from that hour of this first day to the same hour of the second day, be free from any harm." Gruber did not know that within the hour after the Mass, young Nieto would stand within a Pueblo ceremonial chamber, or kiva, before a group of curious Indian men. He swallowed one of the papitos, and then stabbed his hand and wrist with an awl, and to the amazement of the spectators, he suffered no injury. The young Nieto then announced that the whole thing had been a hoax, just a big joke, and he had faked the stabbings. He did not believe in the slightest that the papelitos would keep him free from any harm. Gruber probably did not anticipate that a few days later, Juan Nieto, encouraged by his wife, would report these incidents to the Inquisition. Gruber found himself under arrest. He surrendered without a struggle. The next day he received a visit from Fray Paz, who came to verify an inventory of property, Believing that he could prove his innocence, Gruber asked for an expedited hearing by the Inquisition. He learned that Paz believed him to be a sorcerer who had, according to Sanchez, promised immortality to Juan Nieto on a holy day inside a church while Mass was being said. There would be no pardon. Gruber began to plot his escape. Somehow, he enlisted the help of Antalzio, who had apparently returned to the area, and of Juan Martin Serrano, who had accompanied him to the choir loft. He instructed Antalzio to prepare the way for escape. On June 28, 1670, the agents of the Inquisition learned that Gruber had indeed escaped. Days later, Inquisition authorities would learn that Gruber, weakened by his long captivity and suffering from complete exhaustion and terrible thirst, had collapsed at a waterless place called La Penulas. He had given Antalzio his gun and sent him on southward down the trail. When they returned to that spot, Gruber had moved on. They could not find him. Weeks later, a party of 5 traders heading southward over the foreboding desert made a grim discovery: a roan horse tied to a tree. It was dead. They also found the remnants of clothing, a skull, 3 ribs, and 2 long bones. The Inquisition had claimed another victim. When the Spanish departed the Southwest following the Mexican-American War, and the U.S. claimed the territories, witchcraft was not a crime that authorities were interested in prosecuting. Well, not for the most part. Native tribes and the general populace were free to practice as they saw fit. Many tribes still practice what they did back then. Navajo witchcraft is one example. Navajo witchcraft is a kind of spirituality practiced throughout the great Navajo Nation. It is a phenomenon that is greatly feared and rarely mentioned, especially to outsiders. The Navajo form of witchcraft is not separate from Navajo spirituality. It is simply another set of ways within the Navajo religion. Like other Native American belief systems, it is a form of mysticism. The Navajo believe that people must live in harmony with Mother Earth, and that there are 2 classes of beings: Earth people, who are mortal, and the holy people, who are unseen spiritual beings. They believe these beings have the ability to either help or harm mortals. The Navajo believe illness and life problems are disorder within one's life that can be remedied with herbs, prayers, songs, medicine men, and ceremonies. However, when medicine men learn the Navajo ways to heal and aid those who are afflicted, there are others who practice Navajo witchcraft and seek to direct spiritual forces to cause harm or misfortune to others. The 4 basic ways of Navajo witchcraft are witchery, sorcery, wizardry, and frenzy. None of the 4 are actually witchcraft in the European sense of the word. They are simply additional parts of the vast spirituality of the Navajo people. The Navajo believe there are natural places where powers for both good and evil are concentrated, and that those sacred powers can be harnessed for good or evil. Navajo witches also believe objects such as hair or personal items can be used for both good and evil. The witchery way is the best known form of Navajo witchcraft. Those who practice the witchery way, like all Navajo traditions, learn it from the elders of their family. Very little is actually known about those who practice the witchery ways, as very few Navajo are actually willing to speak about it. It is now time to leave the past behind and turn our attention to the more modern-day witches residing in the Southwest. Modern-day witches in the Southwest, at least in the traditional sense, are like those everywhere. Some may have some Native American herbs or spells that they use, as they live in a region permeated by such, as we have seen. We must recall, however, that much of the Southwest is Catholic, from the Spanish occupation times. The archaic views of such a church often provide a bias for the followers against the craft. Unlike much of the U.S., witchcraft is still frowned upon in the rural areas of the Southwest, and sometimes even in large cities. That's not to say there aren't active witch groups in the region, though. One example of such bias toward witches can be found in the tourist town of Taos in northern New Mexico. If the tombstones at Kit Carson Cemetery could talk, Taos residents might be able to solve a mystery that has contributed to the collection of local folklore. Many grandmas and great-grandmas in the community say that the final burial place for 3 unknown Taos brujas, or witches, exists in the cemetery. For decades, elders have shared the story with younger family members and those who care to listen. The fabled remains occupy a final resting place beneath adjoining asphalt-concrete mixed blocks of equal size, viewed as symbolic sealing off between the women and the physical realm. No one wants the spirits to escape. The space is located at the entrance near the wrought iron gate on Dragoon Lane. 3 large rock fragments at the head of each grave have been reduced to blown-up rock minus any text. These jagged partial blocks offer a semblance of tombstones. The middle mound's marker includes a rusted, broken metal stake. Legend says that the women perform such deliberate, horrific acts against the residents that they are doomed to an eternity of anonymity and eradication of their memory. The exact acts performed by the brujas remain vague, as do the number of people they allegedly affected. But elder sources list the reasons one would suspect from a witch. Did someone become very ill after eating food prepared by the suspects? Witches can spread evil through the preparation of a bowl of chili, you know. Another action told refers to the possession of an article of clothing or another item owned by the target of witchcraft. Even sending bad wishes to a victim without the need to touch or physically see the person could sometimes produce deadly or dreadful results. Like the Salem witch trials, women suspected of witchcraft remained in a difficult spot to prove their innocence. Even today, there are people who desecrate those resting places, illustrating to the rest of us much of the bias and ignorance that is part of their faith, Christianity. Before we leave Taos, there's one semi-celebrity who associated herself with local brujas, or witches. The headline screamed, "60 socialite Taos bruja Butchie Denver dies at 74. When Butchie Denver rolled into northern New Mexico with a menagerie of exotic animals that included Henry the chimp and Myrtle the tiger, she raised plenty of eyebrows. In 1972, after she and Bob Denver split up, Butchie Denver, her kids, and their miniature zoo moved into 3 aluminum trailers north of Taos. Trujillo said she put Myrtle the tiger in a coop with enough room to exercise. Denver was known in Taos as a raving spitfire who wasn't afraid to give politicians a piece of her mind. She was a constant presence at public meetings and community forums, and was passionate about local issues, particularly water. Denver's activism earned her a place among the Taos Brujas, or witches, which also include Fabi Romero and Trudy Healy. "We were foot soldiers, and between us we really got a lot done," Healy said. "We became legendary." Kay Matthews, Denver's friend and activist ally, said Denver was tenacious when it came to seeking justice. She was willing to fight to the bitter end, to not make compromises or cede too much, Matthews said. She knew everybody, and she knew everything that everybody did and had done in the past. While the name Brujah may have been associated with her, she never publicly stated she was a witch, but as they say, sometimes actions speak louder than words. Denver died in 2012 at the age of 74. As earlier noted, the archaic fear of witches in the Southwest was not confined to simply small towns or rural areas. Indeed, a city as large as Tucson, Arizona held a witch trial, and that was in 1971. The Flowing Wells Witch Trial was a series of events that resulted in the 1971 firing of Ann Stewart, a tenured teacher at the Flowing Wells Unified School District, under charges that she claimed to be a witch and taught witchcraft to her students. In late 1869, an expert on folklore and witchcraft from the University of Arizona was invited to speak to upperclassmen at Flowing Wells High School. The presentation included a description of physical attributes for witches. These included blonde hair, a widow's peak, green or blue eyes, a preference for wearing the devil's green, and a pointed left ear. Goodness knows where this so-called expert got these ideas from. Apparently one should not be going to the University of Arizona to study witchcraft. Shortly after the presentation, students began joking with Ann Stewart, an English instructor with over a decade teaching experience, about how closely she matched the description of a witch. Seeing an opportunity to stimulate her students' interest in American literature and folklore, Stewart responded with, "What do you think?" when her students asked her if she was a witch. As Stewart later explained, "I never said I was a witch. I told the students I had the physical characteristics that he had described as a witch, and they chose to believe I was one." She also suggested her students learn about astrology as another method to promote interest in literature. During this time, rumors grew among the student body that Stewart was in fact a witch. Some of the following year's incoming freshmen began speculating Stewart was a witch after she dressed as one for a presentation about folklore given at a local middle school. Stewart claimed her discussion of witches and witchcraft were focused on their appearances in literature. This view is not universal, however, as a petition signed by the majority of her fellow faculty supported her removal. As one student recalled, Stewart discussed witchcraft, but did not try to influence or convince students of the reality of witchcraft. She was suspended from her position on November 27, 1970. The reason for the suspension was teaching about witchcraft, having stated that you were a witch in a way that affects students psychologically. Reports of the suspension made international news, which prompted neighbors and former friends to avoid Stewart, and she started receiving letters that read, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." After her firing, Stewart filed a legal challenge to the board's decision. Her suit claimed she did not receive proper notice of the hearing and that the board violated a state law requiring such a hearing to occur before March the 15th. The court sided with Stewart and ordered the school district to rehire her. They never did, and she went on to become a real estate agent. As we have seen, fear of witchcraft, brought on by the Spanish in the Southwest, has had a deep and negative impact over the centuries. Today, however, times are a little more enlightened, and there are hundreds of witches across the Southwest. While they may still, from time to time, be the targets of persecution or ridicule, They are also seen as protectors of nature and those seeking a return to the old ways. From the ancient Native Americans to the modern witch of today, the craft remains strong. May we learn from history and never judge a book by its cover.
When I emerged into this wide world, there was a vast pulsing harmony in the canyon walls. I remember the embrace of the earth and the sheltering sky and the bright legend of my youth. Now, I am old. The years go their way, and through my life I have seen much of the world. But if you have ever been to the Canyon of the Frijoles, or walked the trails of the Pajarito, or felt the breath of the wind at Painted Cave, you will never come away entirely. A part of you will remain there always. You will have found an old home of the spirit. Our immense journey begins and never ends. We travel as far as we can. Even death is merely another step toward eternity. So let there be wonders along the way. Let the journey be made in beauty and belief. Let us learn to live rightly in this world.